Live on Live.
Well, I am now joined in the studio with Nicholas Norbrook, who is the managing editor of the Africa Report. And this, of course, is for our monthly little get-together here on Paris Live to see what is making the news on the African continent and the Africa Report. You're welcome back, Nick.
Hi, David. Are we going to talk about Benalla?
Well, I don't know. I think we kind of got that one covered now for at least till tomorrow, anyhow. But it's moving so quickly. But look, we have a few articles that we've gone through from the Africa Report today. Let's start with kind of one of the more condensed ones, if you will. It's an interesting thing about the challenges to Ethiopia's national unity. Now, I mean, Ethiopia's been in the headlines a lot recently, especially because of its rapprochement with Eritrea, but also there's been with Oromia, of course, a lot of clashes there between people really heading it off with the authorities in Oromia. But what exactly is in the article that we have in this month's edition of the Africa Report?
Well, we were trying to unpack this incredibly complex situation where groups are fighting for more local autonomy in Ethiopia, who it turns out have been fighting for autonomy for hundreds of years, and the recent disrupting of the security state has allowed these conflicts to resurface. And it reminds nothing quite so much as the end of the Cold War in Central Europe and Yugoslavia, when a Soviet empire was rolled back.
And everything fractured apart.
Exactly, yeah. Because, interestingly, Ethiopia is the only African country, I'm sure your listeners will write in if I get this wrong, but it's the only African country who had its own empire, has its own empire.
Yes.
And, these dormant nationalist or ethno-nationalist questions are now,
coming back to the surface. They're bubbling up.
They are.
And I mean, is this because, are they coming up now because people are looking at, our Prime Minister, should I say, Abiy's kind of youth and his kind of, his more forward-looking approach, if you will, his rapprochement with Eritrea, of course, as I mentioned at the beginning. And are people who are looking to kind of get more autonomy, are they seeing this as an opportunity now to actually put the pressure on them?
I think so. I mean, he is from the Oromo community, which the Ugandan academic Mahmoud Mamdani in the New York Times, he was saying, these ethnic settlement is the leading driver of conflict in Ethiopia, and we wanted to point out, or at least point out Kalundi Seramaga's point that this is 33 million people.
Yes,
the Oromo. That is a country.
Yes,
it's much bigger than Wales or Denmark.
Well, I mean,
substantially.
Exactly.
When if you are from one of these areas in the south and suddenly you see a formerly repressed minority make their way to the top, you start saying, well, perhaps it is our time. And there are now, formal applications which have been made from the Sidama region to become its own separate region within Ethiopia, within the federation structure. But many people are now saying, can this whole federation model hold
together? Because, it's an incredibly ethnically diverse country. From the Afar to the Somalis down in the Ogaden. And then, of course, Tigrinya, the Tigrayans up north. So, it was done... It held together for, how many thousand, was it 1,000 years, 2,000 years under the Selassie, the lineage, if you will.
Well, actually, the sort of the southern parts of the empire were a much more recent
addition.
Happened more in the late 1800s. So this is all very, very recent.
Gotcha. So it doesn't go back the centuries that might spring to mind when we think of the old kingdom of Habesha. Now, we're looking also at the DRC, and this is all about the kind of, it's the post-election horse trading that went on, and the reactions from, let's just say the participants and their colleagues at the African Union meeting in Addis Ababa. So just talk us through this. This is about the deal between Tshisekedi and Kabila.
Exactly that. And of course, we are not party really to that deal.
Exactly, to the ins and outs of it.
But even, I think, over the weekend, the members of the parliament who are under this loose banner. I think it's the FCC. You know, have all pledged their allegiance to Kabila and called him a moral authority. And you know, it's pretty clear, you know, that it was a sort of Putin Medvedev type maneuver that's happening.
Well, yeah.
But there was this interesting clash within the African Union, which is the chair of which is the president of Rwanda, Paul Kagame. No love lost between Rwanda and DRC because of recent history, let's say.
In the last 20-odd years,
yes. But Tshisekedi has now been made the second vice president of the AU. I would have loved to be a fly on the wall of that particular meeting to see what Paul Kagame would have said to that. But I don't think he has any choice. This is a protocol type thing.
And Kagame's on his way out anyhow. It's Al-Sisi, Egypt's Al-Sisi, who's going to be taking over from him. So,
he's the incoming one, yeah.
Yes. So, I mean, this kind of, as I say, horse trading now, is it really... Is it a diplomatic maneuver to kind of keep a lid on things, to give kind of jobs for the boys at the AU? Would that be the right way of looking at it or interpreting it?
I don't know if it is that. I mean, I think Kabila's clique presented this as an African nationalist issue. You know, we're not going to have the West coming in here and telling us that our election was no good, etc. You know, look around. You know, this wasn't perfect. The other thing, really, underneath all of this is just seeing how quickly the West flip-flopped over this.
Well, I mean, in the beginning, everybody flip-flopped. I mean, there were a lot of delays in recognizing Tshisekedi's victory. I mean, then it seemed like it became more of an international thing where if we don't recognize Tshisekedi straight away, China and Russia will get more influence. And then the Americans had to jump on board despite the flaws. But there's some interesting pieces on that where you speak to Herman Cohen, who used to be a regular feature also here on RFI a few years back. He made comments about, the US reaction to it. So just go through that, if you will.
Well, I mean, as you say, the fear of Chinese influence is a big part of that. And Trump had his whole, you know, or rather John Bolton, the Secretary of State, had his whole, you know, view of how the new Cold War type scenario was playing out in Africa. Herman Cohen, he thought, you know, if the US had condemned the election, then they would have been, you know, ripping up US DRC relations, which was pointless because, you know, they had managed to get Kabila out and the system was going to be dismantled. I think that's a little bit optimistic. I think really at the heart of this is half of the world's coltan, which is really the metal of the future.
Indeed.
It is in the Congo and it's under the control of the Chinese. And the Americans don't want to be shut out of that. There's a huge merger which just went through Randgold and Barrick. So that is now an American company. They are in the Congo and they don't want to be pushed out.
Understandable indeed. And there's an interesting point that was also made by one of the commentators in this article saying that the United States' interest in democratic legitimacy may be highly selective right now, as it clearly matters a great deal more to the administration in Venezuela than in the DRC. So is there a certain point there?
I mean, I don't think it's possible to hold this White House up to any kind of moral chart.
We're moving the kind of the floodlights away from the DRC, and then we'll end up in Washington.
We will. All roads lead there.
Indeed, the Eye of Sauron will bring us to Washington. Okay, well, look, and that is a great article about kind of trying to peek behind the curtain at that little horse trading deals being made between Kabila and Tshisekedi's camps. Now, this is another article which you have is your special Africa focus piece, and it's an interview with Patrick Njoroge. Is that how you pronounce his name?
I believe so. Yeah,
Njoroge. So this, the opening quote is this: "For every Japan, there is a mistake." What exactly is this person talking about? Well, who is he, and what is his point here?
So he's the central bank governor of Kenya, and he is very much into open markets. And, you know, he has a good view into what's going on into Ethiopia, across the border, who are trying to do a much more sort of strong state, you know, a state-led development model, as was done in Japan and South Korea. And his point was that, you know, for every Japan, there may be a Venezuela, or there may be a Russia. You know, there are examples where the state has managed to juice development in such a way that you get a Samsung and you get your Sonys, etc. But there are also plenty of much less savoury outcomes possible if you pursue this kind of model.
Well, I mean, Kenya as a country is a very entrepreneurial place. I mean, it really is. You're getting kind of bang for your buck or whatever for your shilling when you're there with lots of startups as a big young population. It's IT development is almost putting Nigeria. I mean, Nigeria is still very much on the top of it, but I mean, it's really giving Nigeria a run for the money. So, I mean, what is he saying about the private sector in Kenya at the moment? What's his take on it?
Well, when I spoke to him, I was very interested in the interest rate caps, which is a legislation that was put in place in 2016 as a kind of populist move because it was hard to get a loan from the banks, and so the government said, well, we're going to fix the interest rates low. They won't be able to push them up higher. And Njuguna said, the governor, if you do that, it'll be very counterproductive because banks will just shy away from lending at all.
Yeah.
They'll be like, okay, we have to lend at a lower rate, well, we just won't lend at all. And that's exactly what's happened. So actually, for all the vim and vigor of Kenya's private sector, they have been severely hamstrung in the last 2 years, and it shows.
And what about the pullout of Barclays from across Africa? Was there any mention of that at all, and how that has affected the banking sector as well, in Kenya specifically, but I mean elsewhere? I mean,
Barclays. The Barclay phenomenon is really down to some bad decisions they made around the time of the financial crisis, 2008, 2009, and the subsequent years. Partly their own internal missteps as Barclays, partly also new regulations called Basel III, which we probably won't bore your listeners with, but it makes it very expensive for banks to complete payments across regions. The impact of this for Africa is critical. We're finding it very difficult now to complete payments to foreign contractors, for example, just because correspondent banking numbers have shrunk because of these global regulations, which have kind of ignored Africa. So the Barclays phenomenon isn't really driven by any Kenyan dynamic.
Okay. Well, okay. My thanks to Nick Norbrook for that look at what is in this month's edition of the Africa Report magazine. So, Nick, stay with us here in the studio, but we will be seeing each other in a month's time.
Great.